This podcast was recorded at 10 a.m. on 5 April Jakarta time. Things may have changed by the time you hear this. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Reformasi Dispatch. I'm Jeff Hutton.
And I'm Kevin O'Rourke.
Today, a discussion on the terrorist attacks in Makassar. We've got refinery fire in Pertamina. And Moeldoko's effort to co-opt the opposition falls flat. Also, an interview with Peter Mumford, the South and Southeast Asia analyst for the Eurasia group. That was a really great conversation. We recorded that earlier in the week. And I was shocked at, frankly, his growing pessimism and the fact that Myanmar is increasingly looking like it might descend into civil war. I don't know what your takeaway on that was there.
Yeah, well, spoiler alert, he said it's a 40% chance. But listen to the interview anyway.
Yeah. And that no one is happy and that there is a few carrots or sticks that anyone can use on these generals that are used to, frankly, living in isolation.
That's right. Yeah, it's a grim situation for sure, and it's getting worse. The death toll has exceeded 400 now already. You know, part of the problem is that this junta in Myanmar is seemingly quite willing to be isolated. But what we talked about in the interview with Peter was interesting because there really are a lot of different facets. And so it's important to think through all the different angles because there's quite a lot because you've got all the dynamics in ASEAN, then you have the dynamics of the UN Security Council in Russia and China, and then the interest of the US and Japan. So by thinking through some of those linkages and connections, it's possible to see ways that you can exert leverage, for example, through Thailand.
Yeah, a couple countries that don't get enough mention and actually have quite a lot of leverage or is not recognized enough, I think, in Western media is Japan, which had big investments there, and increasingly Russia as a sort of a dark horse there. So listen to the interview. It's really interesting. He was very generous with his time. I came away from it enlightened and a little nervous. So I don't know.
Yeah, and also in the interview, we discussed the Quad in light of Indonesia, which is something that almost no one ever does. So far, every time I've heard a conversation of the Quad, it's like they talk about it as if there's a giant gaping hole where Indonesia is in Southeast Asia. It drives me bonkers. I go nuts. So it's like,
yeah.
So we corrected that problem.
We did. You heard it here first. On a more serious note, on Palm Sunday, a husband and wife suicide bombers injured 20 people and killed themselves in a suicide bombing attack at a church in Makassar. This, of course, has parallels with previous church bombings, notably in Surabaya. And I think that for our listeners, we need to establish what the overall security conditions are in Indonesia. Does this portend an uptick in the sectarian violence, or do you think there might be other factors at play here?
Yeah, this is always one of the difficult questions is how to put this into context and assess it and kind of assess trends if there is some sort of trend line. And of course, there was this tragic bombing that wounded 20 people. 4 of them are still in hospital. And then at the same time, there was also basically another suicide in Jakarta, which was a woman brandished what looked to be a handgun. It was later, in fact, an air gun. But she died from gunshot wounds when police returned fire, especially because I think it seems like they thought that she was trying to perpetrate a bombing. So those are the twin attacks that happened last week. And so there you have a trend whereby attacks are increasing, right? But on the other hand, you could also say that these 2 latest attacks, which are the first really since 2018, I believe, since those Surabaya church bombings you mentioned, you can say that they're very low tech. So the duration of the attacks perpetrated by terrorists has actually been declining, especially when you compare it the case 15 years ago or so, and the Bali bomb and the bombs on the hotels in Jakarta.
We've been very lucky, frankly, at the incompetence of the attackers. They're unable to build the bombs and able to deliver it. That's great, but it manages. I guess their calculus is that one bomb is enough. Even if you kill yourself, you get the headlines, and you destabilize. You go some way to make people feel scared, and that's the name of the game. I also wondered, though, and I don't know the degree to which you can talk about this, but I also kind of feel like there is a bit of family vendetta going on here. The woman in whose home the husband and wife team were married was related to another Indonesian husband and wife team who had perpetrated another suicide attack in Jolo, Philippines. So there seems to be these connections, and that they are this nest is radicalizing itself. And my takeaway from that is less of this upwelling of radicalization and more of these really stubborn cells that are radicalizing each other, which is good from a systemic standpoint because it isn't a broader problem. It's maybe more localized, or am I just being naive?
Right. No, I guess so. The role of women in connecting different terrorist cells has long been a focus of study by the authorities. I know, there's this practice of arranging marriages for strategic purposes within various terrorist groups, basically. And lots of times it's the women who are key players in formulating these attacks. And that was certainly the case, it appears, in Makassar last week. The radicalization in Indonesia also really appears to have remained very domestically focused over these past 6 or 8 years, I think. Whereas decade before that, there was a real focus on international targets in Indonesia. So that's something that remains the case in these two most recent attacks. They're focused on, again, on police, because that's been the main target in recent years. Yeah. And then also on the church.
Yeah, it seems to be police first, churches second. And the churches are sort of proxy for Western targets. You can't target American targets or European targets easily, so you just go after Christian churches.
It could be. I mean, I think it's hard to say what it is they're thinking, really.
Right. I was actually in Surabaya on Friday for Good Friday services and visited one of the churches.
And what was that like?
It was. They were wary. They were nervous. They were uncomfortable.
What's the background on this church?
The Indonesian Christian Church, GKI Diponegoro. It's a very unassuming, comfortable, roomy Protestant church, predominantly ethnic Chinese.
And it was the target of a plan, but it was not carried out in 2018?
Well, they were part of the 2018 attacks. It was the mother and the two little girls.
Right, okay.
The mother and the two little girls all had bombs strapped to them. And I was shown the site where the attacks occurred. The teenage daughter apparently detonated her bomb first, and then the mother, and then the 9-year-old girl. And this all happened when the security guard was wrestling with the mother, trying to pull her away. Immediately thought something was up. Never saw a woman in full niqab come up to the church. That just seemed suspicious, and was trying to shoo them away when the explosions happened. And I think that what's important for the listeners to realize is to understand was that the Christians feel safe, unlike in other countries, the members of this congregation felt like the police and the security services are taking their job seriously, that they are intent on protecting them. And they feel that the overriding rhetoric from political leaders is working in their favor, that they're getting the support of the president, of the local leaders. And the community outpouring of support and sympathy was also made them feel less afraid. But the wariness remained. I was speaking with one man who was what's a majelis is like a board member. Is there?
Yeah, an assembly.
He had actually finished the preparations for the service, which was for Mother's Day, to commemorate Mother's Day. And he was coming out of the church. It was early in the morning after making sure, the hymns had been printed, that the sound system worked. That was his job. That was his regular job. And he was witness to this and was just meters away. And he showed me his scars from the shrapnel that hit just under his clavicle. And he said, yeah, we forgive, but, and this was just so honest, whenever I see someone in the devout garb like a niqab, I feel nervous. And I thought that was just, I think that was coming from a very honest place of someone struggling to reconcile their faith with the reality that they are vulnerable. So there were psychological and physical scars.
Yeah, so sad.
Yeah, very sad. But it needs to be said that they feel that they were supported. And yeah. I don't think that you would necessarily get that in other places. Indonesia, on the one hand, they were attacked and they feel nervous, but they do feel like the state is protecting them.
Well, yeah. And again, the police are targets. So there's definitely been plenty of impetus on the part of the authorities and the state apparatus to address terrorism for sure in Indonesia. And they've pursued a law and order, a criminal justice approach rather than an extrajudicial approach. And that has its pros and cons, but I think it's the right way to go, because to take an extrajudicial approach, then that basically just creates a PR disaster that ends up fomenting more radicalization and anti-state anger. Whereas a criminal justice approach keeps the state on the relatively higher moral plane, I think. Of course, the exceptions are that there's quite a lot of shootouts that happen too, and a lot of shootings of suspects by police. But basically, the police really have devoted a huge amount of resources to pursuing terrorist cells, and there's a lot of monitoring of communications that goes on, and they're continually rolling up suspected cells, especially in the wake of an incident or an episode. So after the church bombings last week, there have been 32 arrests nationwide. So it's lots of times what happens then is the ones that manage to continue operating are the very low-level, low-tech, low-capability cells. And I think that's what was, or sometimes what they call lone wolves, expression that's often used. And those are the ones that are able to evade the detection measures by the authorities.
Right. Let's move on to Moeldoko and his faltering attempt that's looking increasingly forlorn to take over the opposition. Falling foul with Cabinet Minister Lawley of Law and Human Rights. Walk us through that.
Right. Yeah. So the big decision that everybody was waiting for weeks came forth from Yasona Lawley, the law minister from PDI Perjuangan. And there was a lot of anticipation about this because on the one hand, it seems as if the merits of the case were cut and dried, open and close kind of case. But on the other hand, the minister is a colleague in the administration with Moeldoko, who's the chief of staff of the president. And they, by necessity, work together very closely. So there was apprehension about what would happen. Also because, as we talked about on one of our podcasts 2 months ago, there was this little noticed case whereby Yasona Lawley issued a very odd decision to recognize Mukti Purwo Pranjono as chair of the small Berkarya party founded by Tommy Suharto. So Mukti ousted Tommy as chair, and Lawley recognized Mukti, and it was a head scratcher at the time. Tommy since appealed in court and won a decision in the lower level. So that was a strange case. It was little noticed because Berkarya is such a small, insignificant party, but that was a factor that caused more apprehension about this particular case, which is huge because you've got the president's chief of staff attempting to oust the party chair of the largest party, and that's Agus Harimurti Yudhoyono, who's the son of the former president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. So it was all very dramatic and high profile. So what happened is that Lawley ruled against Moeldoko and said that the rightful chair is AHY, Agus Yudhoyono. And Lawley added that there were materials that Moeldoko's group were unable to fulfill in their application for recognition to the law ministry.
And the matter is now dead, or they go into the courts?
Well, Moeldoko has pledged to go to the courts. Then the question is, does he or anybody around him have legal standing? Because none of them are members of Partai Demokrat. So if they go to the court and saying that we should be the rightful chairs of Partai Demokrat, then the judge could say, well, what's your legal standing? Because you're not even members of the party, because they've all been ousted by the Yudhoyono-led leadership. Yeah, they'll probably find a way around that. So there will probably be legal battles that continue for quite some time, but it's going to be a very forlorn prospect for Moeldoko to win in the courts, and it's going to be expensive and time consuming as well. I mean, it would consume at least 2 years, by which time the presidential election is going to be creeping right up. So it doesn't really look very promising for Moeldoko at all.
It seems so distracting, and it reflects very poorly on the administration. After his boss, President Widodo, has had to make very plain and explicit that he's not seeking a third term. Might we see Moeldoko be pushed aside, given an ambassadorship to someplace pleasant?
Yeah, I mean, his presence in the administration is not constructive at all right now, because basically this decision by the law minister makes it clear that Moeldoko's efforts to unseat Agus Yudhoyono were illegitimate. Literally, that is the ruling of the law minister. So it really reflects very poorly on the president that his chief of staff would be stooping to such unscrupulous lows like that. Now, Widodo himself has sort of salvaged something, and he's averted a much worse disaster by ruling through his law minister against Moeldoko. So that's been helpful. But Moeldoko's continued presence in the administration, especially if Moeldoko does indeed continue pursuing legal avenues against Partai Demokrat, is going to be a festering sore, basically. It's also going to continue to really further alienate the opposition and make Partai Demokrat and other opposition elements all the more strident. So it's very counterproductive. And it's all pointless and totally unnecessary. So yeah, so it reminds me of the health minister situation, if you remember, when it was quite clear that Indonesia desperately needed a new health minister in the middle of a pandemic, and yet it took Widodo a year to come around to that decision. So something similar might unfold here.
And thus my reference to ambassadorships to someplace pleasant. Terawan is off to Madrid, as if he isn't there already. He has a penchant, Jokowi, for suffering fools, except for Governor Anies Baswedan. Poorly performing members of cabinet and close lieutenants get to stick around for long, seemingly inappropriate periods of time.
Yeah, it is a odd aspect of Widodo's political style. When you look at him himself and his background and career, it's not something you anticipate. But in fact, he keeps a lot of unscrupulous retired generals, in particular, around him. And it's often to his own undoing.
Moving on to Pertamina, a fifth fire in as many years. They have a terrible safety record, and there's an undercurrent of sort of competence or ability within the state-owned enterprise to refine the country's own hydrocarbons. The entire refinery industry seems to be a bit of a mess.
Yeah, well, the good news in this story is that the fire was only in a storage tank. I guess, that kind of puts things in perspective.
Four of them.
Yeah, there were four, but one was full, and the other three, I think, were at least partly empty. I mean, if not fully empty, but it was even still. This one storage tank was just gigantic, and it just burned for 3 days, and it was just towering plumes of black smoke going off into the atmosphere. And then the good news is that no, the refinery's okay.
The refinery itself is okay.
Yeah.
Except it's not, because it can't refine Indonesia's own oil.
Right. Yeah. There's huge problems in the refinery industry here because the government subsidizes premium, which is the main petrol used in the economy. So any investor who goes into refining is going to be dependent on government subsidy policies for their revenue, and that's not attractive. So there's been virtually no private sector investment in refineries for a couple of decades. And the government is desperately trying to refurbish Pertamina's existing refineries, which it's doing a little by little, gradually here and there through Pertamina. But basically, Indonesia has to import most of the refined products that it uses. And even the refining that it does do, most of that uses crude oil that is imported because these refineries were built so long ago that they were built to accommodate light crude, which Indonesia was producing back then in the 1970s. Now that crude production is all gone, and what Indonesia is producing now is heavy crude. And its refinery can't handle that, so it has to export its heavy crude and import light crude. So it's all hugely costly and inefficient,
and wreaks havoc on balance of payments.
Yeah, this is a big problem for the current account and therefore the currency because there's a structural deficit in Indonesia's trade whereby its oil production is declining and its refinery capacity is stagnating. And meanwhile, its domestic consumption of petrol and other fuel is increasing. So its imports of those products are increasing, and this puts ever more pressure on the current account. And there's no corresponding increase of other types of exports, especially manufactured goods, to offset that. And with the downturn from the pandemic, there's been an alleviation because trade of all sorts has plummeted, especially imports. So the current account deficit is not a problem right now, but structurally, those dynamics still exist, and they're probably going to rear their head again when the pandemic finally ends.
Can we talk a little bit? We've just got a couple of minutes left, but it suddenly occurs to me that we haven't touched on Mudik yet, and Ramadan starts a week away. And this year is different from last year because this year police and local officials are maybe a little bit more prepared, organized to prevent the mass migration, and they are helped with a little bit of Indonesian technology. And am I getting the pronunciation right? Is it the Genos or the Genos? It's a breathalyzer that can detect the COVID virus.
Right. Yeah. I think it's Genos probably is what they say in Indonesian, but Genos is what it looks like in English. But it's a breathalyzer, and they're really relying heavily on this now because this is kind of the the linchpin of the strategy for prohibiting mudik, or the mass exodus during Ramadan, because planes, trains, and even buses, and even some passenger vehicles are going to require negative test results for passengers. And the main test that's going to be used actually is probably the breathalyzers, along with rapid antigen tests in some cases. But they're even going to have these available supposedly at rest stops on highways. So motorists are supposed to pull over and take a breathalyzer before proceeding down the road. So yeah, hopefully these things work. I think they do. It's a compelling story, but it's interesting that it hasn't garnered much international attention because it's really is a game changer. Being able to have an instantaneous, low-cost breathalyzer to check whether you're contagious for COVID is very much a game changer. Yeah. One thing else, Jeff, about the pandemic just recently is that Banten has a massive outbreak happening, and it's accounting for almost half of the nationwide cases now, just in the province of Banten. Although there was a spike on 4 April, and that was attributable just to past data that suddenly got updated to the central government from Banten. So there was a sort of a data anomaly one day that accounts for the really huge spike. But overall, the trend is that cases are going down in a lot of places, including Jakarta, but they're really going up quite a lot in the neighboring province to Jakarta, Banten.
The 7-day moving average daily cases is about half, is about 5,000 or so now, is half of what it was in early February. Why is Banten bucking the trend?
Oh, who knows? I mean, I don't know. So that's the dynamics of transmissions, I think.
All right. Coming up, our interview with Peter Mumford of the Eurasia Group.
Good morning, Peter Mumford from Eurasia Group. Peter heads up the analysis of Eurasia consulting and political risk advisory for South Asia and Southeast Asia. So we're very happy to have you here with us today. Peter, thanks for joining.
Thanks very much, Kevin and Jeff. Delighted to be with you today.
Well, we're going to pick your brain today, basically, about Indonesia's role in the region, with a few different trends and developments and dynamics underway. First and foremost, of course, I think has to be Myanmar. So let's dive right in and learn what we can about that. Because, first, let me ask, I suspect this is something you've been working on pretty extensively for the past couple of months, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think, like a lot of analysts, we've probably written more in Myanmar in the last 2 months than we have in the 3-4 years combined before that.
Well, let's see. I guess we've discussed it briefly in the previous podcast with our other guest, Ben Bland from Lowy. So I wanted to get in a bit deeper, really. And it's clear how horrible the situation is there. There's daily updates about the death toll. I guess let's start with Indonesia. Well, the president called for some sort of special summit on the topic about a week ago in mid-March. Any updates on that, and more generally, how do you see Indonesia fit into this, Peter?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a good question. I mean, Indonesia in the past has played quite a leading role within ASEAN in trying to address the Myanmar issue, in particular in the past around the Rohingya crisis. And of course, this has particular resonance in Muslim majority countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. So they've really been at the forefront of trying to sort of coordinate an ASEAN response. And Indonesia, once again, is broaching this issue of dealing with Myanmar. But unfortunately, the bloc ASEAN, although it will likely come together to discuss Myanmar, and plans are in place to sort of work towards a leaders meeting on this, which Indonesia has been proposing, and that would be a step forward. Ultimately, ASEAN can't get over its sort of internal divisions on this issue, as well as the fact that really, ASEAN doesn't have a huge amount of leverage over Myanmar other than perhaps moral suasion. It's lacking carrots and it's lacking sticks as well.
Yeah, that's a key word there, isn't it, with Myanmar, is leverage. Yeah, I want to get back to ASEAN, but since you mentioned the buzzword leverage, who does have leverage over Myanmar?
Well, it's a good question. And I mean, to the extent that anyone externally has leverage, arguably the country that has the most leverage is China. And China arguably is the country other than Myanmar itself that has the most to lose from the terrible situation that is inflicting Myanmar at the moment. But I think it's important to note, I mean, China's leverage is not absolute. There's limitations on what China can do. And in this regard, Russia is very important because, China's leverage comes from, in part, the fact that it is willing to provide international cover and protection for Myanmar. And it's not only doing that for the junta, but did it under Aung San Suu Kyi's government as well over the Rohingya issue, by which I mean, China and indeed Russia are using their permanent membership of the UN Security Council to block any kind of multilateral, much deeper, wide-ranging UN sanctions on Myanmar. And so that's traditionally been one area that China and Russia has been able to exert a lot of influence. But Russia is interesting in this because if Russia comes along to the military junta and Myanmar, and indeed that seems to be what they're doing, and says, we've got your back, whatever you do, then to some extent that reduces China's leverage a little bit because, Russia will still be providing that international cover protection. The other aspects of China's leverage come from the fact that cumulatively it's the biggest foreign investor in Myanmar, not in the last year or two, but cumulatively. It's got about sort of a quarter of FDI stock in Myanmar. Obviously, it's got interests in the oil and gas sector, port project, rare earths, mining. So the sort of economic ties with China are extremely important as well. But that cuts both ways because China needs those things as well as Myanmar needs the investment from China.
So, Peter, I just want to ask you about some of the domestic pressure. Hearing a lot about the protests and their escalation. They're quite violent. And the difference between this time and protests past is that there's been several years in which people have had a taste for democracy and freedom and something resembling rule of law. Now that's being taken away, and there's quite a lot of resentment of that. How much significance should we be putting on the domestic protests?
Well, I mean, they're hugely significant. And I think you're absolutely right. It's a great point you make in terms of the big difference with previous episodes of, junta rule and the sort of less extreme pushback to that. I mean, I would add another factor, which explains the sort of modern phenomenon versus in the past. And that's obviously in the past, there wasn't social media, at least not to the extent there is now. And that has made it easier for, despite the junta's efforts to sort of crack down on internet and close it at times, it's made it easier for protesters to assemble and coordinate than would have been in the past. So, yeah, I think, it's very important. I mean, this is why, we put odds on things at Eurasia Group, and we have a 40% odds that Myanmar will descend into basically a civil war failed state scenario, and by which we mean much more broadly than is the case already, because there's aspects of Myanmar that are already not fully under the control of the Myanmar. It's a very complicated country with a whole myriad of ethnic conflicts. And there's aspects of a failed state already in some areas where the junta are not able to govern effectively, but it's still not at the point where we can say this is a nationwide or a very significant broad-based failed state civil war. But we put 40% odds on that. And that's because these protests are, significant odds that basically the country will go belly up. And that's because right now, it seems, based on what we were just talking about, international leverage on the junta has limitations. And also they don't seem willing to back down on these sort of very repressive, extreme violence they're using to crack down on protesters. And similarly, the protesters are showing, few signs of backing down at the moment. Now, the expectations of most people, and maybe that would include us at the moment, is that eventually protesters will realize, look, the military is not going to back down. It's not going to reinstate Aung San Suu Kyi and her government. Therefore, all we're going to do is be met with this extreme violence and see more people die. So we should, maybe we should calm the protests. Also, the civil disobedience movement, which is this sort of, people essentially almost like going on strike and giving up their work and trying to stop the junta's ability to govern. Not only is that putting themselves at sort of personal security risk in terms of being harmed by the military forces, but also as an economic cost if they lose wages as well. So there are questions to how long the protest movement can be sustained when the junta shows no sign of backing down. But at the moment, both sides are really digging in their heels, and it makes it a little bit harder to call.
Is Myanmar a country that can be self-sufficient if it faces total isolation?
It's very difficult. I mean, it's in the past when it was in total isolation, it was obviously economically in a pretty dire situation, and that's going to be the challenge. I think total isolation will probably be an unlikely scenario because at the very least, Russia and potentially some other countries will maintain links with Myanmar, but obviously that's the vast majority of countries won't. The other point I would add, on the domestic side is it's really key. One thing we're watching very closely is what the different ethnic armed organizations known as EAOs in Myanmar are doing. And there is a collection of these. And really what we will be looking for, at what point can these ethnic armed organizations, the EAOs, actually coordinate into a cohesive, unified resistance to the junta? And we're not seeing that yet. Although some of the EAOs, for example, obviously in Karen and Kachin, are very opposed to the junta, but some of them are a little bit more supportive of the junta. Some of them are sitting on the fence at the moment. And this really is one of the critical watch points.
Is that because some of them are very antagonistic towards Aung San Suu Kyi?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, I think there's a whole host of reasons. I mean, traditionally, Aung San Suu Kyi's government, the NLD, National League for Democracy government, it rose to power on a quite sort of ethnic majoritarian sort of platform. It was quite divisive. Aung San Suu Kyi didn't enjoy as much support amongst the sort of the ethnic groups, which are mostly, but not entirely, around the sort of periphery of Myanmar. And that's sort of one of the factors as well. I mean, some of these groups, though, have had long sort of running battles with the military. And so it's really multidimensional chess going on. We need to, for one of the things we're doing is looking at all these, the list of all these different groups and trying to put them in a tally. Pro-junta, sort of, in the middle, or anti-junta. And when we start seeing those move around, that give us a sense of domestically what's happening. Because as long as the EAOs are fragmented, then it's very hard to see a unified resistance that can really dislodge the junta. Even if the EAOs are united, they don't have the kind of combined military strength that the junta has, but it will be, a different level of pressure.
Right. No, that's what I was going to ask there. The scenario in which just hypothetically they all unite. I wonder what kind of military strength that would amount to. I wonder if anybody is able to even know that.
It's tricky to know with precision, but the Tatmadaw is pretty well armed, and it's hard to imagine that all these groups, the ethnic groups combined, would be able to match strength to strength. But in that situation, we're talking about a real broad-based civil war scenario.
Where would they be getting the money?
They have some of these ethnic armed groups oversee mining areas.
No.
And so, rare earths and minerals, some of them have other economic businesses. Some of the armed groups are believed to be, supported from outside. So, this is a sort of question as well. China has long been believed to back some of the ethnic armed groups that are close to the Chinese border. Although that's something Beijing's always denied, and it's not clear why it would be in Beijing's interest to try and encourage ethnic armed groups to take on the Tatmadaw. So, I think that's how they get their resources and their arms. So it's a very messy situation. The other thing to watch, of course, is this body, which is called the CRPH, which essentially is a committee of former NLD MPs who were obviously ousted in the coup. And they are trying to set up, in effect, a parallel government and claim that they are the legitimate government of Myanmar. And if they take further steps along those lines, and then you also see the ethnic armed groups coordinating towards what is referred to sometimes as creating this sort of federal union, then we really are in a real civil war scenario where you've got effectively competing armies and bodies claiming to be the government of Myanmar.
Well, since there's fairly significant odds that the country sort of implodes, what about the knock-on risks to the rest of the region, to Thailand, to southern China, to Indonesia and Malaysia in terms of refugees? What sort of mitigating policies should the neighbors be putting in place?
Well, certainly, Thailand will be central to this in terms of the refugee impact. But already in the last few weeks, we've seen the Thai army building or expanding refugee camps along the border. So the Thai army is clearly working on the assumption that there are going to be even more refugees. There's reports in the last few days of several thousand refugees from Myanmar coming across the border into Thailand, and that number could increase substantially if, of course, the situation in Myanmar becomes even more dire than it is already. And that's something that the Thai authorities are preparing for I think there's another important read across to Thailand, which we've been talking about, which is, first of all, Thailand's quite dependent on migrant labor from Myanmar. And so to the extent that that gets disrupted through what's happening in Myanmar, that's important. The other factor is that obviously Thailand itself has been sort of engulfed with pro-democracy or pro-monarchical reform protests over the last year. And they had largely fizzled out towards the end of 2020. But in some ways, I mean, there's domestic drivers for this as well. But the crisis in Myanmar has proven to be a catalyst for these protests in Thailand as well. Because they've seen what's happened in Myanmar. They've seen the fact that there is this resistance movement growing and sort of getting very large and influential, if not yet dislodging the junta in Myanmar. They're sympathetic to the protesters in Myanmar. But it's also, made them look again at their own country and think, actually, we need to get active again and we want to get on the streets. Plus, they're also annoyed that the Thai government, which, of course, initially came to power through a military coup in 2014 and then went through a quote-unquote democratic transition in 2019, the Thai government is one of the key backers of Myanmar and probably always will be. And so that's angered the pro-democracy protests in Thailand. So those have sort of sparked off again as well.
So any prospect of change in the position of Thailand, in your view?
I think it's unlikely unless we end up in a situation which we were just talking about where Thailand is dealing with really huge, enormous numbers of refugees that it can't handle, and therefore it needs to see some sort of aims to get stability in the region. But I mean, Thailand really is a protector to some extent of Myanmar. It's important to bear in mind that a lot of the key military leaders in Myanmar have close ties with the military leadership in Thailand. Indeed, the general who led the coup in Myanmar was, I think, a sort of godson of Prem, who was this key figure in Thailand who died recently, but was really the architect of the royal military establishment in Thailand. So those very sort of deep links are very, very entrenched, and it's hard to see Thailand dislodging its sort of its position and support for the junta unless it really creates much more destabilizing impact on Thailand than we've seen. Of course, refugees wouldn't just be going to Thailand. I mean, India has already seen some police from Myanmar fleeing across the border. There would be more on that side. You've got Bangladesh, you've got China as well, amongst other countries. So it would be a broader sort of regional crisis.
And Indonesia too.
Yeah. To some extent. I mean, it's a bit further to go, but you would see them go across all the regions. So yeah, it's potentially a massive regional crisis.
Right.
How about the Biden administration in the U.S. leveraging Thailand to leverage the junta?
Well, personally, I think this is one of the key ways they should be going instead of trying to sort of whack Myanmar directly. I mean, you've got to do the sanctions on Myanmar for a multitude of reasons, and they will be doing that. But the question is, how much leverage does the Biden administration have on the Thai government? And that's a sort of tricky situation. So it's not clear that the US can persuade Thailand to. I mean, I suspect behind the scenes it will, and ultimately it is in Thailand's self-interest that Myanmar doesn't go completely belly up. But where we are right now, I think that Thailand would be hard to convince to take a different stance.
I'm surprised that the situation was so severe and that there is so little leverage. And you would think that into this diplomatic vacuum, someone may be just chomping at the bit to step and burnish their credentials or develop their diplomatic chops. You'd think that the Chinas or the Indonesias or the Indias of the world would step up and come up with some sort of grand bargain. Are you seeing any of that? Or?
Well, I mean, I think definitely that China will want to play a role. So in the sense of it is providing international cover and protection for the Tatmadaw, and it has, for Myanmar for years. But at the same time, behind the scenes, I mean, we've certainly been writing that really this is sort of up to China or has the most influence to kind of solve this crisis. So I'm pretty sure behind the scenes, particularly, of course, as we saw, Chinese factories attacked recently in Myanmar, that behind the scenes, China will be saying to the Tatmadaw, you need to make some kind of concessions. You need to try and calm the situation to some extent. But the Myanmar military itself has got very complicated relations with China, which is why, I mean, we always felt that the initial media coverage of the coup was slightly misleading, and everyone sort of automatically assumed this might be China behind it. And everything in Southeast Asia, when it happens, of course, gets put in the prism of sort of US-China great power competition. But ironically, I would say that the US and China were probably aligned in both preferring that the coup hadn't happened. Now, once it's happened, how it plays out, the US and China interests maybe diverge slightly. But I think it's probably fair to say that both Washington and Beijing would prefer that Aung San Suu Kyi's government was still in power and that the military coup hadn't happened. Because, Aung San Suu Kyi's government, the NLD government, was very kind of favorable towards China. I mean, China made a lot of progress in its interest in Myanmar compared to how it had done before the sort of democratic or semi-democratic transition. So definitely, I don't think China wanted to or actively encourage this situation happening, but it is going to be very pragmatic and is willing to sort of work with whoever is running Myanmar at the time because that's in their interests.
Well, just to bring it back to ASEAN for what it's worth, I know you mentioned that really there's not a whole lot of leverage there, maybe with the exception of Thailand. Can you kind of walk us through the horizon within ASEAN and where the different states shake out vis-a-vis Myanmar and trying to engage with the junta?
Yeah, I mean, ASEAN's sort of big challenge, as I said earlier, is it doesn't really have any carrots and it doesn't have any sticks, given its sort of long-standing policy of non-interference. The other challenge is that although no other ASEAN states are currently suppressing their civilians with military force in the way that is occurring in Myanmar, a lot of the ASEAN countries have pretty patchy records in terms of their democratic credentials, obviously several authoritarian regimes. So it's a little bit hard for them to be arguing on the kind of the pro-democracy cause. But broadly, if you look, I mean, one way of thinking about how the split goes is we looked at, Myanmar just quote unquote celebrated its Armed Forces Day last weekend, which is why, sadly, it was ended up being a focal point for much more violence, and the military did the brutal crackdown, I think record level of deaths. Only 3 ASEAN countries were represented at that out of 8 countries internationally, and that was Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. I'm a bit surprised Cambodia wasn't there as well. But there is a sort of, so I think you've got a split between the Mekongs, who want to be supportive, maybe supportive is the wrong word, but want to at least not be antagonistic to the junta and are reluctant for ASEAN to play a big role. But the other 7 members of ASEAN, I say, I'm not sure about Cambodia, maybe they just missed it by accident. But certainly the others, so your Indonesias, your Philippines, your Malaysias, your Singapores are taking a more robust position, at least in terms of the language they're using, calling much more actively for sort of measures to be taken for the junta to step back from violence. Some of these countries have called for, the NLD, people who've been detained, to be released. And so there is a big variance of views within ASEAN about what should be done and what can be done.
Well, among that group that you mentioned, I think Indonesia really stands out in terms of its democratic achievements vis-a-vis most of those others, and also the current reputation and credentials of its current president, Widodo, vis-a-vis in particular the leader of the Philippines, Duterte. So what should Indonesia be doing? Because I would say it's not enough right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, Indonesia arguably has done as much, if not more, than any other Southeast Asian state. I mean, pretty early on, it galvanized, obviously, the foreign minister, meeting counterparts. You obviously had discussions between Indonesia and Malaysia at the leader level. Indonesia has been proposing these sort of ASEAN meetings. So yeah, I mean, more should be done by ASEAN, but the question is including Indonesia, and this really is a chance for Indonesia to play a leadership role. But as we all know, Indonesia is somewhat of a reluctant regional leader. And, also there's the extent to what they do. I mean, our take is that no matter what happens in Myanmar, it seems, at least at the moment, no matter how bad the situation gets, ASEAN is not willing to contemplate kicking Myanmar out of the bloc. In most regional groupings, what's happening would easily merit, being kicked out of the bloc. Now, I think, a lot of ASEAN countries will defend this by saying, well, that's counterproductive. Being harsh to the junta or kicking them out of a regional bloc is not going to achieve anything. So, let's have them in the room. Let's talk to them. We can't interfere. That's the best way, dialogue. But to be honest, a lot of that is just covering effectively or positive spin on the fact that ASEAN has very little it can do. So, and Indonesia's economic leverage on Myanmar is pretty low. And if you look around the ASEAN countries, last year Singapore was the biggest foreign investor in Myanmar, and you saw actually some of the protests in Myanmar try to sort of boycott Singaporean products to try and sort of put pressure on the Singapore government. Of course, Thailand is a very big economic player in Myanmar, so those are the ones who've got a bit more economic leverage, whereas Indonesia's a bit further away, and I think its economic ties aren't as close with Myanmar. But as you say, as the biggest member of ASEAN, the biggest country, and the one with one of the strongest democratic credentials in the region, it should be playing even more of a role. I mean, I wouldn't want to be too negative on what Indonesia is doing so far, because compared to a low bar of others in the region, it's more active than some others, but it could definitely be doing more. Can I just make one final point, which is on not so much on Myanmar, which is I think really important. One country we haven't touched on, or two countries we haven't mentioned, is India and Japan, and the issue of how the Quad responds to.
I was going to ask you about the Quad, actually.
Okay, well, maybe this is a segue then. So
yeah, well,
I'll let you ask your question then.
Well, right. And into this, how does the Quad factor, and just how seriously should we be taking the Quad? And I'm reluctant to attach too much significance to it because of India's behavior with RCEP. They balked and let that train leave the station. What's the role of Quad in this, and just how much leverage do they have?
Yes, it's a great question. I mean, I'm a little bit more positive on the Quad than you are, I think. And I wouldn't say, I mean, India's sort of departure from RCEP is quite a separate issue to the Quad. And it shows that India is more trade protectionist. And so that's the sort of key concern. And it was a geopolitical loss for India in terms of, shooting itself in the foot by withdrawing from RCEP. But the Quad is not trying to be a trade body. So I wouldn't necessarily say that India withdrawing from RCEP means that India is not serious about the Quad or can't bring much to it. I think the challenge for the Quad is it's proven that it's becoming a more effective body for coordination on the security side, certainly in terms of joint military exercises. At the recent Leaders Summit on the Quad, there were steps taken forward in terms of coordination on vaccine financing, although this is largely going to be the other Quad members helping to finance India's production of vaccines. And Southeast Asia as a whole will be a beneficiary of that. However, I think the challenge for the Quad is going to be moving beyond that. And there's some talk of infrastructure, but moving beyond that into broader promotion of a rules-based system. And on that, I think Myanmar is really proving to be an example of how difficult that's going to be, because it's been fascinating to watch how the Quad countries are approaching Myanmar, and they're all doing it very differently. Now, of course, the US and Australia are extremely aligned on this. But if you look at Japan and India, it's been fascinating because Japan actually has very close ties with Myanmar broadly. It's hugely important for Japanese businesses. The Japanese government and authorities have actually worked with the Tatmadaw in the past, including helping resolve some internal conflicts within Myanmar. So Japan is hugely influential and has a lot of commercial strategic interests at stake in Myanmar and doesn't want to see Myanmar move even more into China's orbit. But at the same time, so it's been interesting to see Tokyo's response, because Tokyo has not gone as far as the US. It's obviously not doing sanctions, but it has been quite forthright in its statements, and more so than India has. And I think we are seeing a difference between Japan and India in terms of how they're approaching Myanmar. I mentioned 8 countries were represented at Armed Forces Day in Myanmar the other day. A lot of eyebrows were raised that India was one of those 8 countries. Japan was not. After that, there was a statement released by a large number of, I think it was coordinated by the US, but a statement released by a large number of countries from defense chiefs of many countries condemning the coup and calling on the junta to refrain from violence against civilians in Myanmar. Japan was a member of that, sort of signed up to that as well. India did not. And I think that will cause some consternation in Washington and elsewhere in terms of how India is reacting to the situation in Myanmar. And there'll be disappointment that India has been one of the countries that's seemingly giving the junta some level of credibility, even if the sort of public statements from Delhi are calling for, no violence and a return to democracy.
Interesting.
I hate to be parochial, but is there a role that Indonesia can play in the Quad? Can it be the Quin? I mean, I was just thinking, if India, why not Indonesia?
I think part of the problem is that once you expand the Quad, then there's no word for an organization with 5 members other than the Pentagon, and that's going to cause no impact. The Pentagon.
So it's a good question. I mean, and there's a related question to this, which is, obviously the G7 countries, with the UK chairing the G7 this year, they're inviting Australia, South Korea, and India to the meeting as well. And so the G7 becomes this so-called D10 of democracies around the world. And as with the Quad and the D10, the largest democracy in the world missing from those groups is Indonesia. And so that has kind of raised questions as to why Indonesia is not in there. I think the simple answer is the same for Indonesia as it is the rest of Southeast Asia. And that is that the Quad has been seen as a China, containment's the wrong word, but China pushback framework. And I think, Southeast Asia in general, but particularly Indonesia, will not want to be associated with something so clearly that is seen as pushing back against Beijing. Because, of course, as we all know, China's leverage or influence in Indonesia has been growing. That said, there is talk of some military exercises between Indonesia and some members of the Quad. So we might see some of this happening, but I don't expect any Southeast Asian country, even Vietnam, which is probably towards the sort of China antagonism, more US leaning end of the spectrum within Southeast Asia, joining the Quad, because I think it would just be too aggravating for their relations with Beijing. But Southeast Asia will very happily be the recipient of Quad's activities, whether it's providing more vaccines, providing more money for infrastructure, or helping to provide broader security and help sort of provide maritime rules. I think the Southeast Asia will be a happy recipient, but won't want to go as far as joining.
Yeah, there's so much ambivalence in Indonesia about China because depending on the day and depending on the topic and who's in the headlines, sometimes it seems like cooperation is barreling forward, but then other times there's serious squabbles, whether it's about use of labor in Chinese projects or incursions on territorial waters by Chinese vessels. And how do you see the vaccine diplomacy fitting into that right now, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, obviously, Indonesia is relying much more heavily on Chinese vaccines than any other Southeast Asian country. And it's really, of course, Sinovac making up the bulk or a significant chunk of Indonesia's vaccination plan. So, that will see China's influence in Indonesia growing. I'm sort of reluctant to say it's a total game changer in terms of Chinese influence or perceptions in Indonesia. Now, if the vaccine rollout is extremely successful and extremely quick, maybe it will help change sort of public views towards China. My personal view is that Chinese vaccine diplomacy across the whole region, including Indonesia, is overstated in terms of its impact. And I think it will be on the margins because, at the same time we're seeing the vaccine diplomacy, we're seeing a lot more Chinese incursions and activity in the South China Sea. So it's kind of, give with one hand and take with the other. And, generally that's resulted in, I think, Chinese sort of approach to the region during the pandemic probably not being a game changer. My personal view is that Beijing has missed a massive strategic opportunity to extend its influence in Southeast Asia even further, although, of course, that is the long-term trend, during the pandemic. So it'll be interesting to watch. And of course, if the rollout of the Sinovac vaccine goes really badly for some reason in Indonesia, could actually backfire and be counterproductive from Chinese influence. But I mean, I think one of the things that Indonesia is trying to get a bit savvier, I think, at is the sort of playing the game of playing the West and China off each other, which I'm not sure that Indonesia was as good at before. So certainly, with the launch of the new sovereign wealth fund, quote unquote, and with, other activities, I think, Indonesia is going around the world more saying, Western countries, you should come invest in Indonesia. We really don't want China to be totally dominant, so you need to come here and help invest and sort of push back against growing Chinese influence while also having good ties with China and getting Chinese investment in several sectors. So I think they're trying to play it both ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that in that sovereign cap in hand fund, there's no Chinese commitments yet whatsoever. It's just
and so certainly what we understand, part of the pitch when top-level Indonesian officials have been going around Western countries asking for contributions to INA, the sovereign wealth fund, quote unquote, as you say, cap in hand fund. Part of the pitch, the Indonesian pitch, is not very subtly saying, look, we've got a lot of Chinese investment in Indonesia and we don't want to be dominated by Chinese investment. So it'd be really helpful if you Western countries and others came and invested as well to kind of push back. And that's part of what they're doing. I mean, ironically, some of the people, of course, who are ultimately responsible for INA have been key figures in drawing in Chinese investment in the first place.
You got your vaccination yet, Peter?
I haven't. I'm not sure when I'll get mine here in Singapore. I think it's I'm just shy of the 45 age category they've just opened up, so I may have to wait a little bit longer.
On the horizon. Good on you. Signed up, apparently, according to the JFCC. the foreign correspondents. I think I'm lobbed in with the diplomats. So who knows? I'll be getting that Sinovac, I think.
Well, I wonder how long before U.S. vaccines start becoming available in substantial quantities, because it seems like the rollout in the U.S. is proceeding so rapidly that, I don't know, maybe there could be a big surplus in the U.S. that suddenly becomes available to rival the supplies of Sinovac that Indonesia has been receiving.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, the other dynamics, of course, are growing use of India-made vaccines, and we were talking about that in terms of the Quad helping to finance that, from the Serum Institute, and indeed Russia with Sputnik, and more countries starting to look at that as they build up their vaccine supplies across the region.
Yeah, the Sputnik vaccine. One thing I heard is that, from what I can understand, it's very effective because it's basically two different vaccines rolled into one. However, it's a very large vaccine. There's quite a lot of material in it, so it takes a large amount of manufacturing capacity to produce it. So really making it on a large scale might be more problematic than some of the mRNA vaccines, in particular, like Pfizer and Moderna. Plus, if the new variants come along, we don't know the effectiveness of vaccines like Sputnik and Coronavac of Sinovac towards some of these variants, like the one in Brazil in particular, the P1. Whereas these mRNA vaccines can be simply updated and potentially rolled out sooner than any others, and to handle that later on this year or next year, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think Southeast Asian countries were very late in terms of, many of them were very late in terms of lining up vaccine supplies, but they've now got fairly diverse set of supply agreements in place. I mean, we, on the China question, we looked at the figures. I mean, this was about a month ago now, so it will have changed. But if you take Indonesia out of it, which of course is 40% of Southeast Asia or ASEAN, but the average amount for the non-Indonesian countries in Southeast Asia, so the other 60% of Southeast Asia, Chinese vaccines only account for about 12% of, I think off the top of my head, about 12% of total supply agreements. And I think if you'd asked anyone a year ago or 6 months ago how prominent Chinese vaccines would be across Southeast Asia, they would imagine it would be a lot more than 12 or so % of total supplies. So
yeah, I think it's extraordinary, though, that Beijing is willing to export so many vaccines when its own population still needs to go under vaccination as well. It looks like there are vaccinations happening on mainland China, but it seems like there could be more if the authorities would stop exporting the way, indeed, the Serum Institute in India has done just recently.
Yeah, I think that is very interesting. And I think that's partly for the sort of geopolitical reasons we've been talking about. It's also partly because, and they've been able to do that to some extent because, cases and deaths are not nearly as high, relative to population size in China as they are elsewhere. But there's always the risk for countries that are relying on supplies that changes, like we've seen with India, where, some of the supply agreements from India have now been brought into question or even delayed because of the recent outbreak in India and pressure on Serum Institute to divert those supplies to domestic needs.
I wanted to ask you about the vaccine patchiness. Countries like the U.S., increasingly Australia, probably Singapore. There's the EIU has been fairly clear about its expectation of a multi-speed vaccination rollout, with some countries, the rich world, finishing up at the end of this year, and then middle-income countries mostly by the end of next year. How do you see that vaccine patchiness playing out in Southeast Asia? Do you see a role for vaccine passports or the travel corridors? It's a really big question, but it's coming at us really fast.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's one we're all, mulling over, especially those of us who are desperate to get traveling around the region again. And yeah, I mean, it's certainly patchy and uneven. As I was saying before, I mean, generally, I think Southeast Asia as a whole was a bit behind the curve in lining up vaccine supplies. And I think, we've seen that actually globally, that a lot of the countries that were ahead of the curve in terms of dealing with the pandemic last year have been behind the curve in terms of vaccine rollout this year, whereas countries that have had the most severe outbreaks, places like the US and the UK and elsewhere in Europe are moving ahead a bit more quickly. Now, in some sense, that makes sense because there's much greater urgency there, and vaccines are sort of produced in some of those countries. So for Southeast Asia, I think they were a bit slow, quite frankly. Some of the countries a bit sleep at the wheel, and so in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of sort of hurrying around by governments in the region trying to secure vaccine supplies, although there are now pretty good stocks. But it's going to take most countries in the region at least this year to vaccinate a significant population. The thing is, to get life back to normal, you obviously don't need to vaccinate everybody or even a huge proportion of the population. Really, you're talking about getting to the point where most of the vulnerable people, if not all of the vulnerable people, so people with comorbidities or over a certain age, have been vaccinated. And we've been looking at this quite closely. I mean, what's interesting is in a country like Indonesia, the age profile of people dying of COVID is a bit different to some other countries. It's younger on average. So I think slightly more than half the people who have, or at least recorded, I emphasize that, recorded as dying of COVID in Indonesia have been below 60 years of age. Whereas if you would look at, say, some of the European or US countries, the average age would be much higher. And so that means, for Indonesia, for example, to get into a position where it can safely say it's vaccinated enough people to be fairly resistant to another surge in cases and the healthcare system being able to deal with that and not having to have too many movement restrictions, you're really talking about vaccinating the overwhelming majority of people, say, over around 55. Whereas for some other countries, you might be saying, okay, we've got to have, most people over 65 vaccinated, for example. The approach that Indonesia is taking is a bit different as well. So it's going to take a bit longer for Indonesia to get there. It's also, of course, as we all know, logistically complicated country to vaccinate in. And that's also true of places like the Philippines. So those are the countries that we worry about more in terms of the potential downside risks, just because of the challenges. Although Indonesia actually, after Singapore, is so far second in the region in terms of the number of people per capita it's vaccinated.
That's surprising, isn't it? That's a good news story that hasn't really got out. That actually Indonesia, for a country of its means and its size and its complexity, is actually doing fairly well.
Yeah. I mean, I would nuance that with it's against a pretty poor regional benchmark, but it's still, compared to expectations, it's not doing badly at all. I mean, it's doing 300,000 to 400,000 jabs a day, I think, at the moment. So it's going to have to accelerate a lot faster than that in order to get anywhere close to its targets. But those were perhaps always unrealistic targets anyway. So if Indonesia can get up to let's say 700,000 a day in a few months from now, then it will be doing reasonably well. And will be perhaps in a position where it can have vaccinated all the key vulnerable people and the elderly by the end of this year.
And the upshot, and I'm not going to keep you much longer, but the key to this is creating confidence in countries that send tourists and investors. Because if the government wants to open up places like Bali in June, but that's not going to matter if you have to quarantine after having visit China at the other end. So there has to be they have to build confidence outside of Indonesia as well as inside. That they're
absolutely hugely important. I mean, I think for different countries, different things matter for vaccination. So for Indonesia, it has a high number of cases and deaths relative within the region, but not by global standards. And it's a domestic demand-driven economy. Tourism is not massively important for the overall size of the economy. I mean, of course, Bali is very important, but overall percentage of GDP quite low from tourism and business travel and stuff. So really what matters is how you can vaccinate the domestic population to the extent that you can get, you don't have to have movement restrictions. That's what really matters for, the Indonesian economy. But of course, if you look at Thailand, actually the domestic rollout of the vaccine doesn't have a huge impact at the moment on the economic outlook, because it is a more trade and tourism dependent economy. The level of cases and deaths within Thailand is pretty low at the moment. So actually, there aren't really many movement restrictions in Thailand anyway. What really matters for Thailand is having more people vaccinated globally and, to your point, the trust to enable them to come in and the processes. And, countries across the region have been very slow in putting together the protocols for, allowing vaccinated people to come back in. I mean, Thailand is so far saying that in the next few months, if you're vaccinated, you can come into Thailand with a 1-week quarantine rather than a 2-week quarantine. But that's not going to make much difference to most people who might be visiting as a tourist. I mean, it will for some, European pensioners who are thinking about coming over for a few months during the winter. But it's not going to for the Asian visitors who will do shorter stay visits.
Not the Chinese tours.
And the overwhelming majority of tourists to Thailand come from elsewhere in Asia. And, most of them will be doing a week, perhaps on average, in the country. So a week quarantine is a no-brainer. Now, Phuket Island is trying to push for, no quarantine for vaccinated passengers soon, but just on Phuket. But, we have to see how that would work in practice. And maybe other countries will follow suit. But it's really quite slow and steady in terms of the progress. And of course, the big question on this is it ultimately hinges on whether governments have confidence that vaccinated people are less of a transmission risk, in addition to being less of a risk of getting sick themselves. And most governments in the region are waiting until there is more clinical data that proves that vaccinated people are at a much lower risk of spreading the virus. And until we have that data, governments are going to be extremely reluctant to lift quarantine restrictions.
Peter Mumford, thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking with you. We are all the wiser for it.
Thanks very much, Jeff and Kevin. It's been a fascinating conversation and really enjoyed it.
Peter Mumford, Head of Analysis at the Eurasia Group, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks to Peter Mumford of the Eurasia Group. Our producer and editor is Stephen Handoko. Music by Blue Dot Sessions. For a free trial of Kevin O'Rourke's Reformasi Weekly newsletter, check out his website at reformasi.info. You can reach us at Instagram at onthelevel_media. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe and rate us. It helps. This podcast is a production of On the Level Media. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.